Welcome to the next installment in our lecture series for American Economic History online here at Rutgers University. And in this chapter, we are going to be doing chapter 17. All right. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about big business, but in particular, the development of large-scale industry within the United States. Previously, we talked about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and its impact in the United States, the transfer of technology from Europe over to the United States, and how the U.S. adopted and then adapted that technology to the unique circumstances in the United States. Now we're doing the continuation of that discussion of industrialization, where the scale and the scope of business in the United States is getting much larger. Originally, when we talked about this prior to the Civil War, particularly the 1830s to the 1850s, industrialization was quickening in pace in the United States, and the size of the companies was growing. Now we're starting to get into much larger, almost conglomerate size organizations. And in particular, one of the things that we want to take a look at is the impact of these larger institutions on the economy, on the workforce, on the formation of capital, on GDP. And we're also going to be concerned with how the composition of industry in the United States changed. So because of the fact that the industries and the companies were getting much larger in scale, what industries were becoming more and more important and what industries were falling by the wayside. We previously noted that fewer and fewer people were involved in farming, so more and more people were moving from the farmlands into cities, and we are going to see a continuation of that trend, that the farming becomes less and less important to the economy of the United States, and industry and manufacturing become much more important. So I want you to remember that in that context I talked about previously in the previous lecture on industrialization in the United States, that this is just a continuation, but what we're concerned with is the scope and the scale of businesses. All right, so we want to make sure when we say heavy industry, we're talking about manufacturing, highly capitalized manufacturing in the United States. In particular, our factor inputs. Once again, we are taking a look at how the mix of technologies used changes, how changes to the importance of labor versus the importance of capital, how that changed over time. We are also going to take a look at technologic change, technologic changes that occurred within industry that changed how items were manufactured. But once again, if you have changes in technology, that changes your factor input scheme. All right, you end up having input substitution. If capital is becoming more productive relative to labor, you're going to switch over to more capital and less labor. But also we're going to talk about market expansion, how the Industrial Revolution and the development of heavy industry in the United States changes the supply side, but also remember that the workers working in these industries are receiving wages, so it's going to change things on the demand side also. So we want to talk about how the market changed domestically and internationally for production in the United States. We'll also take a look at the changing role of the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is an individual who takes land, labor, and capital, uses them together, identifies markets, and tries to exploit opportunities for profits in those markets. So we'll take a look at how the role of the entrepreneur changed during this period. And then finally, we'll go over this notion of Schumpeter, of creative destruction. And in short, and this, there's a forum discussion about this, so make sure you get a good idea about this, is the fact that when you create technologies, those technologies also destroy previous technologies, but also destroy the jobs related to those previous technologies. So I want you to make sure you understand that. So whenever a new technology is developed, it's developed because it is more productive, it is more effective than an alternate technology. So once that alternate technology gets replaced, all the laborers that are associated with that alternate technology get replaced. So keep a keen ear to this section because, as I said, there's a forum discussion that relates to creative destruction and brings it into today's context. Rise of heavy industry. Make sure, and number one, to realize the role that the Ford Motor Company played in this scenario that we're presently talking about. All right. In the year 1913-14, the Ford Company shipped 250,000 automobiles. So that means that 800 cars had to be shipped every day. Means that one car had to be produced every 36 seconds in an 8-hour day. All right? So realize that these numbers, I don't want you to remember exactly these numbers, but I want you to realize what this entails. If you're producing that many automobiles, you're churning out a lot of automobiles. They were producing one car every 36 seconds. And then 10 years later, they'd improved their efficiency to the point that they were producing a car every 15 seconds. So make sure you remember that the scale of production is getting so large that they are producing quite technical pieces of equipment. Producing an automobile is not a simple thing to do, but to produce an automobile every 15 seconds is quite a task. So you can see how, the role of capital is changing in this production process, but also the role of labor is changing. So also realize what this means. This is the culmination of the American system. And remember what the American system stood for. Interchangeable parts, the manufacture of interchangeable parts. And I went over this in a previous lecture of how important the interchangeability of parts was. The fact that we had labor-saving specialization. Henry Ford instituted, wasn't the creator of the assembly line, but he was the most effective at using it, that labor-saving specialization. So instead of having one person assemble an entire car, a person had one specific task on this assembly line. So instead of putting every piece of that car together to create a car for one person might be responsible for putting the left front and left back tire on a car on the assembly line. And that semi-manufactured car would pass by to somebody else and they would add something else to it. So instead of being responsible for multiple tasks, you were responsible for a single task. And that the repetitiveness in doing that task gave you efficiencies, that you would be very specialized in that task and you would be much more effective in doing that than if you were responsible for 15 to 100 different tasks. Also, besides this, the specialization that was occurring with labor, also the fact that we still have higher wage rates means that it's going to be in capital-intensive technologies that are going to be used. That because wage rates are higher here than in other areas of the world, there's going to be input substitution that occurs. That individuals will substitute away from labor because it's an expensive input, and they will substitute in capital, machinery to do the same work of individuals. So make sure you remember, again, what the American system signified. Interchangeable parts in manufacturing, specialization of labor, and capital-intensive technologies. Make sure you can also give some explanation to each one. All right, also realize, and these are just points to give you an example of how quickly some industries grew versus the population of the United States. The output in most American industries grew faster than the population of the United States from 1860 to 1914. That means that per capita output, per person output, was growing in the United States. That means that labor productivity was increasing in the United States. So just a few examples, and if there's any type of questions that are asked, you might want to remember an example or two. Examples of growth: printing grew by tenfold per capita. That means the output in the printing industry grew tenfold per person. That the average person was producing 10 times as much for their work as previously in 1860. So by 1914, a person working in the printing industry on a person level basis, that the productivity of an individual worker grew by tenfold from 1860 to 1914. Machinery and petroleum, sixfold per capita increase. That means per worker in the United States, output grew 6 times faster than the growth of the population. Chemicals, the same way. So you realize that production is growing much faster than the population as a whole. And in total, if you look at manufacturing in total, manufacturing grew 5 times relative to the increase in population. So we're not seeing increases in output due to increases in population. We are seeing increases in output because of the American system of manufacturing, the interchangeability of parts, the specialization of labor, and the capital-intensive nature of that manufacturing. So let's take a look at industrial production. We took a look at one similar to this from 1790 to 1850, 1860, I believe. Remember that break point was around 1830 where there's a dramatic increase. From 1850 to about 1880, we see a consistent trend growth, but then we see a break after 1880. That the slope of industrial production in the United States is relatively flat leading up until 1880, and then that the slope of that trend line changes, it becomes much more steep. So make sure you realize that if we talk about the pace of production, industrial production in the United States, it's increasing from 1850 to 1880, but it's relatively flat. Even though it still has a positive slope. But after 1880, we see a dramatic increase in the trend of industrial production in the United States. So here just gives you an example of different industries. Value added, let me just give you an example of what value added is. Value added is if you take the cost of your inputs, and then you do a manufacturing process on it, and then you sell that output. The value add is the difference of the cost of your inputs versus the product that you sell at the end. So for example, if you're a sheep farmer and you have sheep, there's wool that you have zero value at the end, beginning of the year after you cut the wool off the sheep. By the next year, the wool has regrown. You cut it off and sell it. And let's say you take that where there was no wool, having zero value, and you end up with $1,000 worth of wool. The value added in cutting that wool off the sheep would be $1,000. So you take the initial cost of your inputs and subtract off what you, after you do a production process on it, and then you subtract that off of the price, and that tells you how much value you've added to the process. So we can see that some industries had a tremendous increase in the value added from 1860 to 1914. Now, I don't want you to remember all these going through. These numbers are not exactly important, but I want you to realize that the scope of this, if we take a look at printing, the value added in 1860 was roughly 23 million. By 1914, it was 670 million. A 40-fold increase in value added in production in that industry. And the per capita value added a 10-fold increase. All right? So I want you to realize that you can look at the amount of value added that's being created in these industries. And in a 54-year period, there are dramatic increases that printing and instruments. Basically, in 1860, the instruments industry was almost non-existent in the United States, and by 1914, that had grown to almost 100 million, close to a 30-fold increase in instrument production in the United States in terms of value added. All right? So just realize that. Now, like I said, these numbers, I don't want you to remember these numbers, but remember that some of these industries saw dramatic increases in the value added that they produced between 1860 and 1914. All right, so we'd have to take a look at how factor inputs changed during this time period. So if you're going to increase production, as we've seen in that previous slide, we saw dramatic increases in value added through a whole host of industries. Where we have to increase our inputs, We have to increase the amount of land, labor, and capital that we use in order to produce that. Where was the major increase in factor inputs? Once again, we can see that it is in the use of capital. There was a tenfold increase in the amount of capital from 1860 to 1910. That compares to a 3.4-fold increase for labor and a 3.7-fold increase in land. So capital was almost 3 times as important as land or capital as a factor input in the production of the United States during this industrialization period. So I want you to realize that, how important the use of capital was in the economic growth of the United States post-Civil War between 1860 and 1910. And realize that this falls in again with that American system and the scarcity of labor. Labor was a relatively high cost, so we end up seeing capital being substituted for the scarcer resources, or the scarcer resource here being labor. So once again, this fits in with the American system because we are substituting away from a higher resource, labor, into a relatively cheaper resource in terms of capital. And during this time period, I want you to remember particularly this bullet point. We have growing incomes, consumption, and investment. So we see that we see higher levels of investment in the industry. We also see workers consuming more, and we also see people's incomes increasing. So this economic growth was across the board. It was industry-wide. Industries are producing more, workers are consuming more, incomes are going up during this time period. So the wealth that's being created is being spread out. It's not being spread out evenly, but we're seeing that all people generally are doing better during this industrialization period. This is just pointing out to you the fact that you can have this type of continuous growth, because as families' incomes increase, they can save less, but they can end up we can see an investment actually increasing and consumption actually increasing during the same time. So for example, we actually see, if we look at our example here, that savings increases is 20% in year one. But in year two, it's equal to 25%. But we end up seeing consumption growing. Why do we see consumption growing? Because real income is increasing. Real income doubled during this time period. If income in the first year was 100, then income was 150 in the second year. We see a 50% increase in income, which means that people can save more, i.e. invest more, and yet still see consumption increase. That increase in savings is not draining away from consumption, so consumption is increasing during this time period. So it's one of the explanations why we saw continuous economic growth, that people's real incomes were increasing. And even though there was greater investment, i.e. there needed to be greater savings, that greater savings did not put a damper on consumption because of the fact that incomes were growing fast enough to accommodate the increased investment that was occurring during that time period. Here, I just want you to have a general idea as to what were important industries in the United States and how they changed from 1860 to 1910. Realize in 1860, the most important industry in the United States was cotton goods, followed by lumber, boots and shoes, and flour and metals. But remember cotton goods, because where does cotton goods fall in importance by 1910? It moves down from the top to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th place. So we see cotton being very important to the economy in 1860 and dropping in importance. Also, where do we see at the very top? Machinery. Where do we see that in 1860? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It just happens to be the same exact number. We see cotton goods and machining and machinery flip-flopping places. All right, cotton goods was the most important in terms of value added in 1860, and machinery was in 7th place in 1860, and by 1910 they flip-flop. Machinery is in 7th place, and cotton goods machinery is in 1st place, and cotton goods falls to 7th place. So I think like I said, you don't have to remember all the details, but if you can remember that there was a shift away from this farming staple type of product, cotton goods being the most important. And that falls to seventh place while machinery becomes much more important. And the thing that's important in machinery, what we end up seeing is companies investing in machines to make other pieces of machinery. So they have capital investment that creates capital equipment for other individuals. And that the staple product, a farming product of cotton goods, falls in importance. This sort of highlights what happens in the United States as a whole. What happens in the United States as a whole is during this time period, farming becomes less and less important. That's manifested by the decrease of cotton goods from the most important in terms of value added in 1860 to the seventh most important in terms of value added in 1910. All right, I just believe I went over that particular side. So the other industries, just like I said, I'm not too keen on these types of details. I'm more keen on your general knowledge. And if you realize that change in value added with cotton and machinery underpins the changing industrial pattern and the shift away from farming, that is the most important thing to remember. All right, so technologic change. Let's go over the American system again. There's a system of standardization of parts, and I told you previously why that's important. I mean, we take this for granted. All right, imagine if you had a MacBook Pro and somebody had this MacBook Pro and they bought at the same time and the adapter did not fit right. So you couldn't use their adapter to charge your computer and they couldn't use your adapter. All right, it decreases the value of that product because the pieces are not interchangeable for one another. And especially, I mean, we're talking about higher levels of technology. This is even more important when we're talking about mechanical pieces, where if you have a gun, etc., that if you take the firing pin out of one gun made by the same manufacturer, same type, it should fit in with the other gun. This did not occur before the American system, I don't want to say it was adopted or was sort of evolved in the United States. That each piece, every gun was made individually by hand, so there was no commonality between those pieces of capital. So realize that the standardization of parts is quite important. We also talked about the division of labor. The division of labor allows for increased productivity because if you specialize in a particular task, you become more productive in that task. Also, the uniformity of work method, i.e. the assembly line. You have a process for producing something, and you use that process over and over and over again. So you go through the process, you fix the process, you tweak it, you make it as efficient as possible, and then once you have that method in place, that is how you produce a car or produce a gun. So for example, if there are 50 pieces in a gun and it's being assembled in an assembly line, each person would be responsible for a particular component of that production. Somebody might be responsible for screwing the wood into the handle of the gun, and then it moves down to the next person, and next they have to put another piece on the gun, etc. So every single part of the production process is broken down into a specific task. And also of importance of the American system, if you had routine tasks that could be mechanized, capital was adopted in place of labor to take the place of labor. So if you could have a machine, for example, nowadays we have robots. If you take a look at the assembly line of Henry Ford from the 1914s, you see it's very labor intensive compared to today. Why? Because we see mechanization of routine tasks. You have machines that do welding. You have machines that will put windshields into a car that's being assembled. You have machines that will put tires on the cars. So once the technology evolves to the point where it is cost effective to replace labor with a piece of capital to do that work, that mechanization of a routine task that's a repetitive task over and over again. But realize that machine is set up to just do one task. All right, also realize that the effect of technologic diffusion, in particular, custom goods and capital goods are custom made to produce standardized products. All right, so that diffusion, that of technology of that assembly line, in, for example, the automobile industry, diffuses to other areas. So they start to adapt and use capital and use a standardized production process very similar to what was used in the automobile industry. And also, you end up producing capital goods on large scale. So goods that are in themselves capital goods, you have capital goods producing other capital goods. So they become standardized. So the technology ends up converging with one another. We're not just seeing technologic capital being used to produce, mass produce shoes or shirts or any number of things, but we're also saying that that technology evolves to the point where machinery is being used to make other pieces of machinery. All right, this technologic change, make sure you understand the difference between making something and manufacturing. Making something is very much a task-oriented system, but it's a human system. Let me give you the example between making and manufacturing. If you go to a tailor and have a suit custom made for you, they are making a suit. They are making a suit to your specifications. They are measuring your waist, your inseam. If you're having a dress made or whatever, they are making that dress specifically to very specific specifications that are based upon an individual. For manufacturing, it is not, when you go out and buy a pair of pants, they are not perfectly suited for you. They might be off just slightly. The waist might be a little bit tight, or the pants might, the legs might be a little bit too long or a little bit too short. In manufacturing, you're standardizing the production of a particular product so it fits the most people. So you're not making one pair of pants or one pair of slacks for a man or a woman. You're making a pair of slacks that can be made by multiple individuals. All right. And remember, the United States goes through this process of adopting technology. I should put this in quotes. Some people would say we stole the technologies from Europe. All right, but you adopt technologies from another region, but you just don't use those technologies. You realize that the situation in the United States is slightly different, so you take those technologies and you adapt them to the American system. You adapt them to that. So, for example, there were European measurement technologies, but the industry in the United States adapted the production of those to the specific needs, i.e., they used even more capital than the Europeans did because labor was more expensive in the United States than it was in Europe. And finally, the fact that when you invest in all of this capital, you have upfront costs, you have fixed costs, and it, in terms of minimizing your total cost or your average total cost of production, if you invest this money up front, you have to produce a lot of output. You have to have greater production of output so you can spread those fixed costs over more and more items. For example, let's say I go out and buy a pizza oven for $5,000. Now, I'm making that number up. I don't know how much a pizza oven costs, but let's just use that number. If I buy that pizza oven and make one pizza, my average fixed cost for that pizza is $5,000. So I'm going to have to sell that pizza for $5,000 plus in order to make money or to break even. If I pay $5,000 on that pizza oven and I produce 5,000 pizzas, that's costing me $1 per pizza to produce. All right, think of that also, but also in lines with different levels of technology, where I have one pizza oven or two pizza ovens or three pizza ovens, that my average total cost is going to decline as my production decreases because I can spread those fixed costs out over more and more units. So the thing I want you to realize with technologic change is that as you adopt this technology and you invest in that capital up front, you're going to have increases in output in order to spread those costs out. You have to exploit economies of scale. You're going to have to produce at a lower average total cost at higher levels of output. All right, give you a couple of examples in the steel industry. The steel industry in 1860 was able to produce 10 tons of steel a day, but by 1910 it was able to produce 500 tons of steel a day. 50-fold increase in daily productivity. All right. Also, the fact that what did this do to price? If you wanted to buy a ton of rail for railroads in 1873, it would cost you $120 per ton. By 1900, this had fallen to $17 a ton. So I want you to realize also that what happens that you have to be more productive in producing this. You have increases in production and demand staying relatively the same, that the price of steel fell dramatically during this time period, yet the steel industry was very strong. So why did this steel industry, was it able to remain strong when the price of per ton of steel was falling? Because it was getting more productive. It was able to produce steel at a much lower cost per ton than it did in 1860. And the reason for this is I want you to realize that these two terms, make sure you remember them: the Bessemer converter for steel, and then the open hearth furnace. In particular, how over this latter part of the 1800s, the open hearth furnace became more and more important in the steel industry. I mean, if you take a look of total production, let's take a look at 1870. All right. So here they only produced 2,000 short tons, where the Bessemer converter is producing 42. All right. So the open hearth furnace was only producing roughly 3% of the output of steel production in the United States. And then by 1913, it had risen to close to 70%. All right. This is an example of the input substitution, that the Bessemer converter was the initial default technology in steel production. All right, but then the open hearth furnace was much more efficient. So over time, more and more companies converted over to the open hearth furnace versus the Bessemer converter, because of this technology was much more effective. It was it produced steel at a lower average total cost than the Bessemer converter did. So I want you to realize that from this particular table, that in the steel industry, we end up seeing a conversion from the Bessemer converter open to the open hearth furnace for steel production. Why do we see that? Because the open hearth furnace is more cost effective than the Bessemer converter. So also, if you're producing these items, I want you to be keenly aware of this, that if you produce output, it has to be sold somewhere. If we produce stuff and nobody's buying it, then it's pretty pointless. So where does this output go? So number one, you have to realize that the domestic market increased because of the fact that we saw a threefold increase. The population in the United States tripled from the Civil War to World War I. So a portion of that increased output is going to domestic consumption. But realize what happened during this time period. So even though the population increased threefold, output in the United States increased sixfold. Per capita output doubled between this time period. All right? So realize that a portion of this increase in output is going to be purchased domestically, but a portion of it's also going to be sold internationally. And this just gives you a number of GNP growth. And take a look at how dramatic GNP growth was from 1834 to 1908. All right, almost an 11-time increase. But you can see, where do we start seeing the most dramatic increases? We see a doubling from 43 to 58. Again, almost a doubling from 58 to 78, etc. So we see some dramatic increases at the beginning of in the middle of the antebellum period. But we see what? Continuous economic growth throughout the United States during this time period. Okay? So that's the one thing I want you to realize, that from 1830 to up to the World War I, it was a period of almost continuous economic growth, a continuous increase in what was being produced in the United States. What other things do I want you to realize? That how important capital was in production. Prior to the Civil War, capital formation in the United States was at a level of 14 to 15%. After the Civil War, it was 24 to 28%. Once again, pointing out that how important capital formation was to the growth of the economy in the United States. And capital formation in the United States remained high even up until World War I. So I want you to realize that we have a portion of that production being sold in a domestic market. We see during this time period from the Civil War up until World War I, we see a threefold increase in the population of the United States, which means a portion of that production is going to satisfy domestic demand. But because of the fact that we saw a six-fold increase in production in the United States in that same time period, that the remainder of that increase in production has to be exported to other countries. So what we end up seeing is that the economic growth and the industrialization that occurred in the United States helped to foster domestic demand or account for domestic demand, but the fact that also led to export growth industries. That percentage that wasn't consumed domestically was shipped to other countries. So we ended up becoming more of an export nation during this time period. Remember, in the colonial period and in the early parts of our existence, we were very much had a balance of payments deficit. We bought more stuff abroad than we sold to other countries. We start seeing a shift in that during this time period, that we end up becoming a net exporting country because of that. All right, I want you to understand the distinction between invention and innovation. All right, you can invent something. You can invent a new app, a new item that you can sell on TV, a new piece of software, a new product, and if you never take it out of your workshop, it never impacts the economy. So you can invent something, but if it doesn't ever go to market and is never sold, it's pretty much irrelevant. All right? The fact that invention versus innovation, once you understand the importance of the product and that the fact that it can be sold, all right, you can invent a product, but if you don't understand that it has sales potentials, that you can produce it, sell it, and do that better than anybody else, all right, that is what is meant by innovation. So if you create something and never sell it or never realize the potential it has, invention without the innovation part is meaningless. Because if you invent the item without knowing it has marketability, that you can put together a process to produce it, sell it, and do this better than anybody else, that's the innovation part that makes it important. The example I always give with this is, if you think of one of the largest companies in the world today is Microsoft. And how Microsoft got their start was that Bill Gates realize that computers in themselves are worthless. That piece of the hardware that you have as a computer is worthless unless you can do things with it. So he realized that unless you had an operating system, the software that allowed the computer to interact with other pieces of software, that was the most important part. Just like a computer is worthless without electricity, he realized that the operating system and the software packages, or the apps as we call them today, the applications, were the most important thing. That they were so complementary to computers, they were actually more important to the computers themselves. You could have a computer, but if you don't have a stable operating system and you don't have software that people can use, the computer itself is worthless. And not a lot of people realize that Bill Gates never created the operating system for Microsoft. They actually bought an operating system from somebody else. So somebody else invented or created the coding for the operating system, but Bill Gates and the people at Microsoft realized the importance and the marketability. So they were able to produce it, market, sell it, and do that better than anybody else. So that distinguishes between the invention, the creating of the operating system, versus the innovation of realizing this is important. They realize that the operating system and the software is what's going to make the computer important in the future. All right, Joseph Schumpeter. Make sure you remember Schumpeter and this notion of creative destruction. Uh, competition drives resources out of the marketplace. Realize that the notion of competition is that if you are losing money, you will go out of business. All right, so if you're not as efficient as somebody else, you are going to, it's almost a survival of the fittest notion. All right, so you're going to be driven out of business by more successful individuals if you're not efficient. So competitive forces drive businesses out of business. Companies go out of business because they are not as efficient as others. So Henry Ford is the example given here. He produced cars, and what do you think happened to the individuals who made carriages that were pulled by horses? They started to go out of business because he provided a resource that was better than the horse-drawn carriage. So those carriage manufacturers and the individuals who repaired carriages, etc., all those people lost their jobs. They had skills that were no longer needed. Like today, the example I give today is I talk about the technology of ATM machines. All right, I'm sure if you look at banks today versus banks 30 years ago, the percentage of their payroll that goes to tellers is much smaller today than it was in the past. Why? Because the technology has developed that, number one, can give money to individuals out of their account. You don't have to go see somebody, but you can also deposit checks. And now with online banking, you don't even have to write checks. So realize that as the technology evolves, it means that it's going to be doing away with jobs. That's what it's meant by creative destruction. The creation of a new technology destroys any technology that competes against the new technology and is less effective. All right, so new products and ideas are adopted, old ones are abandoned. The example I give with this too is one of the first jobs I had in the it was 1990, I believe. I had an internship at a large insurance company in Philadelphia. All right, I can remember going on my tour, and they showed me the quote unquote secretarial pool. And probably you guys are saying, what the heck's a secretarial pool? Secretarial pool is it was a large room filled with generally women whose job it was to type for people. So, for example, if you wanted a letter to go out to somebody, you would write it by hand, and then it would go to the secretarial pool, and somebody in the secretarial pool would type that up, and then the handwritten note that you had and the printed, typed on a typewriter document would be sent back to you so you could see if it matched what it was, and it should be mailed out. Secretarial pools don't exist anymore. Why? Because we have computers. We have computers. We have Microsoft Office. You have scheduling. All these different types of things. So technology has replaced certain skill sets in the economy. Also, I want you to realize that what Schumpeter said in this notion of Schumpeterian growth. He believes that business cycles and particular business upswings are driven by innovation. That there is an innovation that occurs in the economy, and that when the innovation is adopted, there's economic growth associated with that innovation, with the replacement of old technologies, etc., and so on. So the innovation itself causes the business cycle upswings that actually occur. Another example I can give you, most of you probably have never been to a quote-unquote record store or bought a record. All right? Never bought vinyl. Either you've bought CDs or you've purchased things online. All right? All the people who used to work at record stores, where are their jobs? Those jobs are gone. The creation of an alternate way to distribute music. What has it done? It has eliminated a whole industry. The record companies, the business of selling records to individuals. I can remember being a kid, that was a big deal. You would talk to your friends and go, let's go to the record store. Let's see what new records came. You wouldn't even have any idea what records came out. You'd walk through, you'd flip through the albums. And in case of me, sometimes you would buy an album just because the album cover looked particularly cool. Sometimes you got some good music, sometimes you got some lousy music in that process. All right. So just realize that's what Schumpeter is talking about, that there was growth associated with that type of innovation. All right. Also, innovations sometimes are linked to one another. So you have spin-off industries that grow from that innovation. So, for example, we talk about cell phones. Now you have cases for cell phones, and the applications that you can use with your cell phones are all spin-offs of that. But also realize that when you have these upswings, there's a tendency for the upswing to occur for too long, and then we end up having a correction known as a recession. But also, his point is that recessions actually cause growth, because during a recession, what happens? Companies go out of business, people lose jobs. The inefficient companies, or the companies or industries that relied on outdated technology, no longer exist. So there is potential for growth coming out of the recession.